Hello, everyone. I start my presentation with the claim of Alexei Miller, who noticed that the politicization of memory, so characteristic for countries of Eastern Europe, now became a global phenomenon. It's obvious that after the collapse of communism, memory regime became a site of symbolic struggle on the national level. My question is if we can observe the analogous mechanism or process on the local dimension. During the long-standing field research, I discovered that many places in Poland, many local communities with a strong cultural identity carry on some kind of memory policy. Better we could say a vernacular strategy of commemoration. It's a politics with small p. All of them were politically justified, and what is important, most of them started much earlier than 1989. It brings us to my main thesis, which can be divided into historical and theoretical aspects. First, as you see, from a historical perspective, we can say that on local dimension in the memory field is not connected, the turning point in the memory field is not connected with the fall of communism, but first of all with the war trauma. And it's a trauma refers to the Second War or the Great War, or even to the events from 19th century when Poland was under the partition. Second, from theoretical point of view, many local communities create their memory regime as the answer to the external constraints needed to deal with trauma and create a mythical narrative about the past. Here, the myth is very useful because explains the word, makes the word meaningful, divides all the pieces of the universe into good and evil. So we can say that we are living in the moral universe. My argumentation will be focused on one case study, a community of Wąchock, which is a small town in Świętokrzyskie Mountains. It's a central eastern Poland. This region characterizes a very traditional conservative way of life and patriotic and strong Catholicism. In the context of the whole region, Wąchock is marked by a very distinctive identity based on the historical myth. I will try to show how it's constructed, this myth. The main plot of the narrative consists of 3 threads, which are connected through 2 mechanisms, condensation and displacement. I borrowed these terms from psychoanalytical jargon. By condensation, I mean a combination of some elements, ideas, feelings, and images that are put into one object of our experience. By displacement, I mean a real or symbolic transfer from one place to the other. Both mechanisms are responsible for the mythical form of the story. The first element of this myth is the Cistercian Abbey from 12th century. The spectacular monument is a main memory site in the town and the most important institution on very levels. The Cistercians founded Wąchock and ruled there until the beginning of 19th century. Then the monastery was dissolved and the monks disappeared and the building had stayed. But the building had stayed. After 130 years, in 1951, they returned and renovated the cloister. Since then, we can say that they had have had a great impact on the local memory field. Especially, they enforced the anti-communist tendency, because the church in Poland is always and was always a strong player in this game, anti-communist game. The second element of the story is the figure of Marian Langiewicz, the first dictator of January Uprising from 1863. The January Uprising was a big rebellion against Russian invaders, and it's still relevant for us in process of nation building, because in this event all social layers took part, and the nobles and the peasants. Langiewicz stayed in Wąchock about 2 weeks in his headquarters for gathering people together and established the republic, so-called Republic of Wąchock, a symbolic community of free Poland in this time. What is important, the inhabitants of Wąchock still believe that it was a very meaningful episode, however it wasn't, during the uprising. And they are strongly convinced that they paid their share by losing town privileges. The third threat in the myth is connected with the Home Army, which was the dominant Polish resistance movement during the Second World War, and especially with the legendary Captain Jan Piwnik, pseudo Ponore, who commanded the partisan groups on the terrain. As a result of his attacks, of several attacks, the Germans committed a massacre of the civilian population in Michniów, the near village, and killed over 200 people, which was a huge atrocity. And as a consequences of these events, Ponore's unit was dissolved and he was sent to the east region of Poland, now Białorussia, where he was killed in a manhunt a year later. In the post-war Poland, Ponore became one of the famous representatives of the Kars soldiers, a real hero of anti-communist underground. Currently, a crypt with his ashes is located in the cloister of the Cistercian Abbey, becoming a place of religious worship. So the convergence of these three elements has determined Wąchock's genius loci, which affect how its inhabitants perceive and experience the past. We can call this memory local community nexus. It consists of material and non-material objects, practices, modes of commemorations, or positions in the memory field, like, for example, group of guardians of the myth and their enemies. Let me present now how all these elements are linked and intertwined. Above all, there is two most important events in the 20th century mentioned by my interlocutors: the comeback of the Cistercians of the Cistercian monks, and the second burial of Ponore in 1988, 2 years before the end of communist regime in Poland. Thanks to the intervention of the Cistercian abbots, Ponore's ashes were brought to Poland from Białorussia and deposited in the monastery. I have to add that the funeral was attended by approximately 100,000 people. As you see, this is a photos from this event, and it was one of the largest pro-independence demonstrations during the 80s in Poland, of course. Until now, this crypt, as I mentioned, this is a crypt, is the place of strong cult, strong worship. The next relevant memory site is the Fight for National Independence Museum and Memorial, also located here, sorry, also located in the cloister side. This is a collection of patriotic artifacts, hand claps, jewelry, weapon from the January Uprising, from the Warsaw Uprising, because the Warsaw insurgents felt that they were the successors of the latter, and up to the Solidarity movement from the 80s. This is a mnemonic condensation. We see an example of mnemonic condensation based on vicinity of all these elements. Just they are put together, laid together, and in one room, one space, and create a new message as a whole. Another element linked with the museum is the pantheon. Is the pantheon of the memory of the Polish underground state. The cloister wall, in this case, was used by the Home Army adherents to display the names of all fallen commanders, and additionally, why not, Langiewicz Memorial as a symbol of a continuity of Polish resistance and patriotic attitude. The last example of spatial condensation is the case of the Vicus Chapel. This is a symbolic place in the forest, 10 kilometers far from Wąchock, where Ponore's unit were hiding from the Germans. It's quite far from the town, but the Wąchock inhabitants, the school youth and scouts mainly, visit the place regularly to celebrate the anniversary of his death, the Ponore's death. After every celebration, there is a holy mass in the monastery church in the center of the city. So the participants perceived it as one celebrated space. And what about displacement? Taking into consideration that none of these events, as I mentioned, is connected directly with the Cistercians, because, let's emphasize, they were absent in Wąchock during this time. It seems to be a good example of displacement, a basic mechanism, as I understood, is a basic mechanism of collective unconsciousness. And one more striking example is the displacement of the statue of Captain Ponore, which is the original was erected on the central square in the town. This is original, and the copy now is held in the monastery, indicating the way to the crypt. So we can see as the inner space of the monastery and the public space of the town are overlapping. To sum up, all these symbolic activities strengthen the consistency of this local memory field. This led us to the conclusion. I try to explain how it's possible that people in Wąchock say that there was no decommunization in this place. They mention it by one reason. There was never real communism there. The only real thing in this place is the Cistercian Abbey in material and non-material spiritual dimension. This is a central actant of the commemoration practices, a focal point, a center of gravity's field. Even though they have been absent from Wąchock for over 130 years, I have to repeat it again because it's a very paradoxical fact. So even though they have been absent both during the January Uprising and the Second World War, The historical myth of Wąchock is built on a combination of all three elements in an arbitrary but not accidental way. They strengthen they strengthen and justify one another. The symbolic effectiveness of the myth is confirmed by the fact that the inhabitants are convinced that the monastery is, and always was, a center of national patriotism. Moreover, this patriotism, this belief that Wąchock's past is a symbolic part of our national history, constitutes the source of the local identity, which radiates over the entire region. That's why the small Wąchock is so big on the symbolic level. The core of this myth has nothing in common with the moment of the transformation in 1989, but is deeply rooted in the anti-communist opposition from 50s and 60s. That's why local trajectory of memory field has different dynamics, as I show you, comparing with the level of official national institutions and politics memory. That's it. Thank you for your attention and see you soon.